Eleanor Hayes had been invisible for so long that she'd almost forgotten what it felt like to be seen. Every morning at 6:30, she arrived at Westbrook High School through the back entrance, the one near the dumpsters that nobody else used. She'd clock in, grab her cleaning cart, and begin her day the same way she had for the past 8 years. Mop the hallways, empty the trash bins, wipe down the desks, replace the toilet paper in the bathrooms. It was simple work, quiet work, and that's exactly what she needed. At 42 years old, Eleanor looked older than her age. Her brown hair was always pulled back in the same loose bun, a few gray strands framing her tired face. She wore the same navy blue cardigan over her work uniform, the edges frayed from years of washing. Her hands were rough and red from chemicals and hot water. When she walked, she kept her eyes down, watching her feet move across the linoleum floors she'd just mopped. She never made eye contact. She never started conversations. She was simply there, like the lockers and the water fountains, just another fixture in the building. The teachers barely noticed her. When they did, it was usually to complain. Mrs. Peterson from the English department once snapped at her for vacuuming too loudly during her planning period. Mr. Davidson, who taught chemistry, had a habit of leaving his classroom a complete disaster and then acting annoyed when Eleanor couldn't get all the stains out of the floor. The younger teachers sometimes said hello, but most just walked past her like she was part of the wall. The worst place was the teacher's lounge. Eleanor's break time happened to overlap with the lunch period, so twice a day she'd slip into that cramped room to eat her sandwich and drink her tea. She always sat in the same corner chair, the one with the torn cushion that nobody else wanted. She'd unwrap her lunch slowly, trying not to make any noise with the plastic bag. Around her, the teachers talked and laughed, their voices filling every inch of space. They talked about their students, about who was failing and who was succeeding. They talked about their weekends, their vacations, their children. They complained about their spouses and bragged about their accomplishments. The room buzzed with life and energy, and Eleanor sat in the middle of it all like a stone in a river, letting it all flow around her. Sometimes they talked about her. Not to her, but about her, as if she couldn't hear them or wouldn't understand. Mrs. Chen, the music teacher, once told a story about asking Eleanor to move some chairs in the band room. "I had to explain it 3 times, she'd said, laughing. "I'm not sure if she's just slow or if she doesn't speak English well." The other teachers had chuckled, and Eleanor had kept her eyes on her sandwich, chewing slowly, pretending she hadn't heard. Principal Morris was the worst. He was a tall man with a booming voice who loved to hear himself talk. He prided himself on knowing everyone's name, on being friendly and approachable, but he treated Eleanor like she was simple-minded. He spoke to her slowly and loudly, using small words as if she were a child. "Eleanor, trash. Need empty," he'd say, pointing at the overflowing bin in his office. She'd nod and take care of it, and he'd pat himself on the back for being so patient with the help. What none of them knew, what none of them could have possibly guessed, was that Eleanor heard every word they said. She understood every joke made at her expense, every dismissive comment, every assumption about her intelligence. She heard it all and felt it all, and she kept it locked inside the same place where she kept everything else that hurt too much to look at. She hadn't always been like this. There was a time when Eleanor had been different, when she'd walked into rooms and people had stopped talking to listen to her. There was a time when her name had meant something, when newspapers had written about her, when strangers had asked for her autograph. But that was a lifetime ago, in a world that felt so distant it might as well have been a dream. That world had ended on a rainy Tuesday afternoon 15 years ago. One moment she'd had everything: a beautiful family, a career she loved, a future that stretched out bright and full of promise. The next moment it was all gone. The police officer at her door, the hospital, the funeral, the silence that followed so loud it drowned out everything else. After that, Eleanor had stopped being the person she used to be. She'd stopped doing the thing that had once defined her entire existence. She'd packed away that part of her life into boxes and shoved them into the back of a closet, where she'd never have to see them again. She'd moved to a new town where nobody knew her name or her face. She'd taken the first job she could find, something simple that didn't require her to think or feel or remember. For 8 years, she'd succeeded in staying hidden. She came to work, did her job, went home to her small apartment, and repeated it all the next day. She didn't have friends. She didn't have hobbies. She didn't have anything that might crack open the carefully constructed walls she'd built around herself. It was a half-life maybe, but it was safe. It was manageable. It was all she could handle. The students were kinder than the teachers in their own way. They didn't mock her or make jokes. They simply didn't see her at all. She was invisible to them, a ghost who appeared to clean up their messes and then vanished. Sometimes a kind student would say thank you when she held a door open. Sometimes they'd smile at her in the hallway. But mostly she was just part of the background of their teenage lives, as forgettable as yesterday's homework. Eleanor preferred it that way. Being invisible meant being safe. It meant nobody asked questions. It meant nobody expected anything from her. She could move through her days like a shadow, present but not really there, alive but not really living. She had a routine and she stuck to it religiously. Morning hallways first, then the classrooms on the east wing. Bathrooms before lunch. Teacher's lounge during the afternoon break. Gym and cafeteria after school let out. She knew exactly how long each task took. She knew which teachers left their rooms messy and which ones were neat. She knew where the students liked to hide their trash and where they carved their initials into the wooden desks. In the evenings, she'd return to her apartment and make herself a simple dinner. She'd watch television without really watching it, letting the noise fill the silence. She'd go to bed early and sleep dreamlessly, or at least that's what she told herself. Then she'd wake up and do it all again. This was her life now. This was all it would ever be. She'd made peace with that, or at least she thought she had. She'd convinced herself that she didn't want anything more, that she didn't need anything more. The past was buried and it needed to stay buried. Opening that door again, letting herself feel and hope and want, that was too dangerous. The pain of losing everything once had nearly destroyed her. She couldn't survive it a second time. So Eleanor stayed invisible. She stayed quiet. She stayed safe in her small, contained world where nothing could hurt her, because nothing could touch her, and she would have continued that way forever. If Mrs. Chen hadn't made an announcement one ordinary Tuesday afternoon, that would change everything. Where the announcement came during the afternoon break on a Tuesday in late April, Eleanor was in her usual corner of the teacher's lounge, halfway through her tuna sandwich, when Mrs. Chen walked in carrying a clipboard and wearing the kind of smile that meant she was about to make everyone's life more complicated. "Attention, everyone," Mrs. Chen called out, tapping her pen against the clipboard. The chatter in the room died down. "I have exciting news. The school board has decided that this year's staff appreciation evening will include a talent show, and everyone is required to participate." A collective groan rose from the teachers. Mr. Davidson looked up from his phone with annoyance. "Everyone? That seems excessive." "Everyone means everyone," Mrs. Chen said cheerfully. "Administration, teachers, and support staff. The board thinks it will be good for morale and team building. Plus, the students are excited about it. Several have already asked if they can attend." Eleanor felt her stomach tighten. She kept her eyes on her sandwich, hoping that somehow she'd be overlooked, forgotten the way she usually was. But Mrs. Chen was making her way around the room with her clipboard, and Eleanor could hear her getting closer. "Now I need everyone to sign up and tell me what you'll be performing," Mrs. Chen continued. "We have 4 weeks to prepare. Don't be shy. It doesn't have to be anything fancy. Sing a song, tell some jokes, show us your stamp collection. Anything goes." The teachers began throwing out ideas, some joking, some serious. Mrs. Peterson said she'd recite poetry. Mr. Davidson suggested a science demonstration. The gym teacher, Mr. Wallace, flexed his arms and said maybe he'd do a strength routine. Everyone laughed. Then Mrs. Chen reached Eleanor's corner. She looked down at the clipboard, then at Eleanor as if she'd just remembered the janitor was in the room. "Oh, Eleanor. You too, of course. Everyone participates." She said it slowly, enunciating each word. Eleanor felt every eye in the room turn toward her. Her face grew hot. She wanted to disappear, to sink into the torn cushion of the chair and never resurface. "So, Eleanor," Mrs. Chen said, her voice taking on that patient tone people use when they think you're not quite capable of understanding. "Do you have any talents? Anything you can do for the show?" The room had gone quiet. Eleanor could feel them all watching her, waiting. Some looked curious. Others looked amused, like they were anticipating something entertaining. Mr. Wallace was barely suppressing a grin. Eleanor opened her mouth, but no sound came out. Her throat had gone completely dry. "Come on now," Mrs. Chen pressed. "Surely there's something."
"Can you sing?"
"Dance, cook, tell jokes?" Maybe she can demonstrate the proper technique for mopping floors, Mr. Wallace said loudly. Several teachers burst out laughing. Even Mrs. Peterson, who was usually more reserved, smiled into her coffee cup. Or she could show us how to fold fitted sheets, Mrs. Davidson added, and more laughter rippled through the room. Eleanor's hands were shaking. She set down what was left of her sandwich, no longer hungry. She wanted to run out of the room, but her legs felt frozen. Everyone, Mrs. Chen said, though she was smiling too. Be nice, Eleanor, really, what can you do? We need to put something down on the list. Eleanor's voice came out as barely a whisper. Piano. What was that? Mrs. Chen leaned in closer. You'll have to speak up, dear. Piano, Eleanor repeated, only slightly louder. I can play piano. The room went silent for a moment, then erupted in poorly concealed snickers. Mr. Wallace let out a bark of laughter. The piano, really? Well, that's wonderful, Mrs. Chen said, though her tone suggested she thought it was anything but wonderful. She wrote something on her clipboard. The old piano in the auditorium hasn't been used in years, but I suppose we can get it ready. Have you played much, Eleanor? Eleanor nodded, not trusting herself to speak again. Recently? Mrs. Chen asked. Eleanor shook her head. Well, you have 4 weeks to practice, Mrs. Chen said brightly. I'm sure it will be lovely. She moved on to the next person, and gradually the conversation shifted away from Eleanor. But she could still hear the whispers, the barely contained laughter. This is going to be a disaster, someone muttered. I almost feel bad for her, someone else said. Almost. Does she even know how to read music? That was Mr. Wallace again. Eleanor gathered her lunch and slipped out of the room. In the hallway, she leaned against the wall and closed her eyes, trying to steady her breathing. What had she done? Why had she said piano? She could have said anything else. She could have said she'd tell a story or show photographs. Anything would have been better than this. She hadn't touched a piano in 15 years. She'd walked past them in stores, in hotel lobbies, and churches, and had felt nothing but a dull ache, a reminder of everything she'd lost. The thought of sitting at a piano bench again, of putting her fingers on those keys, made her feel sick. But it was too late now. She'd signed up. Mrs. Chen had written it down. In 4 weeks, she'd have to stand on a stage in front of all these people who already thought she was simple and slow, and she'd have to play. They expected her to fail. They were probably looking forward to it, to having something to laugh about later. Over the next few days, the talent show became the main topic of conversation at school. Teachers discussed their acts in the hallways and at lunch. Some were taking it seriously, practicing during their planning periods. Others treated it like a joke, planning deliberately silly performances. Eleanor heard them talking about her. They didn't even try to hide it anymore. I heard Eleanor signed up to play piano, Mrs. Peterson said in the hallway, not bothering to lower her voice. Can you imagine? That old thing probably doesn't even work anymore. I give her 30 seconds before she gives up, Mr. Davidson replied, if she can even figure out how to start. The students picked up on it too. Word spread that the quiet janitor lady was going to play piano at the talent show, and it became a running joke. Kids would pass her in the hallway and mime playing piano, then laugh. A group of seniors started a betting pool on how long she'd last before running off stage. Eleanor heard them talking about it in the cafeteria while she emptied trash cans. My money's on 2 minutes, Max, one girl said. I don't know. I think she might surprise us, her friend replied. She might last a whole 3 minutes before completely bombing. Eleanor kept her head down and kept working. She told herself she didn't care what they thought. She told herself it didn't matter. But at night, alone in her apartment, she felt the old familiar weight pressing down on her chest. She'd worked so hard to stay invisible, to avoid exactly this kind of attention, and now she'd put herself directly in the spotlight. She thought about quitting. She could just not show up that night. She could call in sick. She could even quit her job entirely and find work somewhere else. But something stopped her. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was stubbornness. Or maybe, buried deep under all the fear and pain, there was a tiny part of her that remembered what it felt like to play, and that part of her was waking up whether she wanted it to or not. 2 weeks before the show, Eleanor did something she hadn't done in 15 years. After her shift ended and the school was empty, she walked to the auditorium. The door creaked when she opened it. Inside, the space was dark and silent. She found the light switch and the overhead fluorescence flickered on. There it was at the center of the stage, the piano. It was covered in dust, surrounded by stacked chairs and forgotten props from old-school plays. Eleanor walked down the aisle slowly, her footsteps echoing in the empty space. She climbed the steps to the stage and approached the instrument like it might bite her. She pulled off the dust cover and coughed as particles filled the air. The piano was old, probably 30 years or more. The wood was scratched. Several keys were yellowed. She pressed one key gently. The note that came out was flat and tinny. Eleanor sat down on the bench. Her hands hovered over the keys, trembling. She could hear her heart pounding in her ears. Slowly, carefully, she let her fingers rest on the cool ivory. And then for the first time in 15 years, Eleanor began to play. The first notes Eleanor played were wrong. Her fingers fumbled on the keys, hitting wrong notes, her timing completely off. The sound that came from the old piano was harsh and discordant, nothing like music. She pulled her hands back as if the keys had burned her. She sat there on the bench staring at her hands. They were shaking. These hands that had once moved across piano keys with impossible speed and grace now felt clumsy and foreign. 15 years was a long time. 15 years of not playing, not practicing, not even thinking about music if she could help it. Eleanor stood up and walked to the edge of the stage. The empty auditorium stretched out before her, rows and rows of seats that would soon be filled with people waiting to watch her fail. She should leave. She should go home and forget this whole thing. But her feet wouldn't move. She thought about her daughter, about the way she used to sit beside her on the piano bench when she was small, her tiny fingers trying to copy the way Eleanor's hands moved. She thought about her husband, who would listen to her practice for hours and never get bored, who said her music was the most beautiful sound in the world. The memories came flooding back, and with them came the pain she'd spent 15 years trying to avoid. Eleanor walked back to the piano and sat down again. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath. Then she started with something simple, a basic scale. Her fingers moved slowly at first, finding their way across the keys like they were remembering an old path. The notes were still off, the piano desperately out of tune, but there was something there. Muscle memory. Her hands remembered even if her mind wanted to forget. She played that scale over and over until her fingers stopped shaking. Then she tried a simple melody, something she'd learned as a child. It was rough and hesitant, but it was music. She played until her hands ached, until the fluorescent lights above her started to hurt her eyes. When she finally looked at the clock on the wall, 3 hours had passed. From that night on, Eleanor came to the auditorium every evening after her shift ended. She'd lock the doors so no one could come in, and she'd practice in the empty space. The piano was terrible, truly awful. Half the keys stuck. The pedals squeaked. The whole thing was at least a half-step flat. But Eleanor worked with it. She had to. The first week was the hardest. Her fingers were stiff and her back ached from sitting at the bench. She'd forgotten how physically demanding playing could be. She made countless mistakes, hit wrong notes, lost her place in pieces she used to know by heart. More than once she put her head in her hands and wanted to cry. But she kept going. Each night she stayed a little longer. Each night the music came back a little more. During the day she continued her regular work. She mopped floors and emptied trash cans and cleaned bathrooms. The teachers continued to make their jokes. Mr. Wallace had taken to humming off keynotes whenever she walked past, then laughing. Mrs. Chen asked her once if she was practicing, and when Eleanor nodded, she'd patted her shoulder with exaggerated encouragement, the way you might praise a child for trying their best. "That's wonderful, Eleanor," she'd said. "Just remember, it's all in good fun. Nobody expects perfection." What Mrs. Chen meant was that nobody expected anything at all. They expected her to embarrass herself. They expected to laugh. Some of them, Eleanor suspected, were actually looking forward to it. The students were even worse. The betting pool had grown. Now they were taking bets not just on how long she'd last, but on whether she'd even show up at all. A group of juniors had started calling her Piano Lady, in mocking tones whenever they saw her. One kid made a video pretending to play piano terribly, and posted it online with a caption about the upcoming talent show. It got hundreds of likes. Eleanor saw all of it and heard all of it, and she tucked it away somewhere deep inside where it couldn't distract her from what she needed to do. Because something had happened during those late-night practice sessions. Something unexpected. The music had started to come back not just to her fingers but to her heart. She remembered why she'd loved this. She remembered the feeling of losing herself completely in a piece of music, of her hands and the piano becoming one instrument, of creating something beautiful out of nothing but her own skill and emotion. It had been such a huge part of who she was, and she'd locked it away for so long that she'd forgotten it was even there. 2 nights before the talent show, Eleanor made a decision. She'd been practicing simple pieces, safe pieces, things she could play without too much risk of messing up. But that wasn't enough. If she was going to do this, if she was going to stand on that stage in front of all those people who thought she was nothing, then she was going to remind them and herself who she really was. She was going to play Rachmaninoff. It was insane, of course. Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2 was one of the most difficult and demanding pieces in the classical repertoire. Even at her best, even when she'd been performing professionally, it had required intense focus and preparation. She hadn't played it in nearly 2 decades. The piano was terrible. She'd only been practicing again for a few weeks. But Eleanor knew this piece like she knew her own heartbeat. She'd performed it dozens of times in concert halls around the world. It was the piece she'd been playing when she got the news about the accident. It was the last piece of music she'd heard before her world had ended. Playing it again would either destroy her or set her free. There was no middle ground. She started that night. The opening was difficult, requiring both hands to move independently in complex patterns. Her first attempt was a disaster. She had to stop after 30 seconds, her hands cramping, her mind unable to remember what came next. But she tried again, and again, and again. The next day at work, Eleanor moved through the building like a ghost. She was exhausted from staying at the auditorium until nearly midnight. Her hands hurt. Her back hurt. Everything hurt. But there was something different about her. Something the teachers almost noticed but couldn't quite put their finger on. Mrs. Peterson commented on it at lunch. "Is it just me, or does Eleanor seem different today?" Mr. Davidson looked up from his sandwich. "Different how?" "I don't know. Less timid, maybe? She made eye contact with me in the hallway this morning." "That's new." Mr. Wallace laughed. "Maybe she's finally excited about her big performance tomorrow night. Ready to show us all her incredible talent." He said the last part with heavy sarcasm, and the other teachers chuckled. But Eleanor, sitting in her corner, didn't react. She was thinking about the music, running through the fingering in her mind, preparing herself mentally for what she was about to do. Let them laugh. Let them mock. Tomorrow night, everything would change. The evening of the talent show arrived with perfect spring weather. The sun was setting as people began arriving at the school. Teachers came with their families. Students showed up in groups, excited for an evening of entertainment. The auditorium filled quickly, the buzz of conversation and laughter echoing off the walls. Backstage, performers were warming up and preparing. Mrs. Peterson reviewed her poetry. Mr. Davidson checked his science equipment. Mr. Wallace stretched and flexed, preparing for his strength demonstration. Mrs. Chen rushed around with her clipboard, making sure everyone was ready and knew when they'd go on. Eleanor sat alone in a corner of the backstage area, her hands folded in her lap. She was wearing the same clothes she always wore, the same navy cardigan over her work uniform. She hadn't bothered to dress up. This wasn't about what she looked like. This was about what she could do. Mrs. Chen spotted her and came over, her expression a mix of pity and concern. "Eleanor, you're up in about 30 minutes. Are you ready? Are you nervous?" Eleanor looked up at her and smiled slightly. It was the first time most people at the school had ever seen her smile. "I'm ready," she said quietly. "Well, remember," Mrs. Chen said, patting her shoulder again. "Just do your best. That's all anyone can ask." Eleanor nodded. Mrs. Chen had no idea what her best was. None of them did. And in 30 minutes, they were all about to find out. The acts before Eleanor ranged from awkward to entertaining. Mrs. Peterson recited a poem about autumn leaves that made half the audience check their phones. Mr. Davidson's science demonstration, with dry ice, got decent applause. A secretary from the main office sang a karaoke version of an old pop song, slightly off-key but with enough enthusiasm that people clapped anyway. Mr. Wallace did his strength routine, lifting weights and flexing while his family cheered from the front row. Through it all, Eleanor waited backstage. She could hear the laughter, the applause, the occasional groan when something didn't go as planned. Her heart was pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. She looked down at her hands. They were steady now, calm. They knew what they needed to do. Mrs. Chen appeared beside her, slightly out of breath from running around all evening. "You're next, Eleanor. Are you sure you're ready? We can move you to the end if you need more time." "I'm ready," Eleanor said. Her voice was quiet but firm. Mrs. Chen looked uncertain but nodded. "Okay then. I'll introduce you in just a moment. Remember, it's just for fun." Everyone's very supportive. Eleanor almost laughed at that but didn't. She stood up and walked toward the stage entrance. Through the gap in the curtains, she could see the audience. The auditorium was packed. Every seat was filled. Students sat in groups, whispering and laughing. Teachers sat with their families. Principal Morris was in the front row, looking at his watch. She heard Mrs. Chen's voice over the microphone. "Our next performer is someone many of you see every day but might not know very well. Eleanor Hayes works hard to keep our school clean and running smoothly. Tonight she's going to play piano for us. Let's give her a warm welcome." The applause was polite but scattered. Eleanor heard some snickers from the student section. Someone whispered loudly enough for everyone around them to hear, "This is going to be good." Eleanor stepped onto the stage. The lights were bright, much brighter than she'd expected. For a moment, she couldn't see anything beyond the first few rows. She walked to the piano, her footsteps echoing in the sudden quiet. The audience was watching her now, really watching her. She could feel their eyes, their judgment, their expectations of failure. She sat down on the bench and adjusted it slightly. The piano looked even worse under the stage lights. The wood was scuffed and dull. Several keys were visibly chipped. It was, by any measure, a terrible instrument. But it was what she had. Eleanor placed her hands on the keys. In the audience, Mr. Wallace leaned over to whisper to the person next to him. Several students had their phones out, ready to record. Mrs. Chen stood in the wings, her expression a mix of encouragement and second-hand embarrassment. Eleanor closed her eyes. She took one deep breath, then another, and then she began to play. The opening notes of Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2 filled the auditorium. Not hesitant, not fumbling, not the amateur attempt everyone expected. These were the notes played by someone who understood them deeply, who had lived inside this music for years. Eleanor's right hand moved across the keys in the powerful opening melody, while her left hand provided the rich rolling chords underneath. The effect was immediate and stunning. The whispers stopped. The phones that had been ready to record something embarrassing now captured something else entirely. People who had been slouching in their seats sat up straight. Mrs. Chen's mouth fell open. Eleanor's hands moved faster now, attacking the keys with precision and power. This piece demanded everything from a pianist: technical mastery, physical endurance, emotional depth. It required the hands to move independently in complex patterns, sometimes moving in opposite directions, sometimes coming together in thunderous chords that used the entire keyboard. And Eleanor played it flawlessly. Her body swayed with the music, moving with each crescendo and diminuendo. Her fingers flew across the keys so quickly they seemed to blur. The old out-of-tune piano that shouldn't have been capable of producing beautiful sound somehow came alive under her touch. She coaxed music from it that the instrument had no right to make, compensating for its flaws with her own skill. The famous romantic melody emerged, achingly beautiful. This was the part of the piece that movie soundtracks had borrowed, that ice skaters performed to, that made audiences cry in concert halls around the world. Eleanor played it with such emotion that people in the audience felt their throats tighten. Some of the teachers who had mocked her just days ago on themselves blinking back tears. In the front row, Principal Morris sat frozen, his face pale. He knew enough about music to understand what he was witnessing. This wasn't someone who'd taken piano lessons as a child. This was a master at work. The piece continued, building in intensity. There was a section where both hands had to execute rapid runs up and down the keyboard simultaneously, a part that was notorious for tripping up even accomplished pianists. Eleanor played it perfectly, her hands moving like they were one with the instrument. Mr. Wallace had completely forgotten to smirk. He sat motionless, staring at the stage in disbelief. The students around him were equally stunned. The ones who'd been ready to mock, who'd made bets about how quickly she'd fail, now watched in absolute silence. Mrs. Peterson grabbed her husband's arm and whispered, "Oh my God, do you know what this piece is? Do you know how difficult this is?" Her husband, who knew nothing about classical music, could only shake his head. But he could tell from the faces around him, from the absolute silence in the auditorium, that something extraordinary was happening. Eleanor was completely lost in the music now. Her eyes were closed. Her face showed every emotion the piece demanded: joy, sorrow, passion, despair, triumph. She wasn't just playing notes. She was telling a story, painting a picture, sharing something deep and true about what it meant to be human. The memories flooded through her as she played. Her daughter's laugh, her husband's smile, the feeling of performing in great concert halls with orchestras behind her, the years of practice and dedication, the joy of creating beauty, the pain of loss, all of it poured through her fingers onto those keys. The piece built toward its famous climax, the part where the pianist had to produce thunderous, rolling chords that seemed to shake the very air. Eleanor's whole body was involved now, her arms rising and falling, her shoulders moving, her feet working the pedals. The sound that came from that old broken-down piano was impossible. It was magnificent. The final section approached, the part where everything came together, all the themes and melodies intertwining in a powerful conclusion. Eleanor's hands raced across the keyboard, executing passages that would have challenged any professional pianist. Sweat beaded on her forehead. Her breath came quickly, but she never faltered, never missed a note. And then, the final chord. Eleanor's hands came down on the keys with perfect timing, producing a sound that seemed to fill every corner of the auditorium. She held the chord, letting it ring out, her foot on the sustain pedal. The sound slowly faded, growing quieter and quieter until it disappeared completely into silence. Eleanor's hands lifted from the keys. She sat perfectly still, her eyes still closed, her chest rising and falling with each breath. The auditorium remained absolutely silent. 3 seconds passed, then 4, then 5. No one moved. No one spoke. No one even seemed to breathe, and then someone in the back row stood up. Then someone else. Then another. Within seconds, the entire auditorium was on its feet. The applause started like thunder, loud and overwhelming. People weren't just clapping. They were cheering, shouting, some openly crying. Eleanor opened her eyes and looked out at the standing ovation. The lights were too bright to see individual faces, but she could see the shapes of hundreds of people on their feet, applauding for her. For what she'd done, for who she was. Mrs. Chen stood in the wings with tears streaming down her face, her hands pressed to her mouth. Principal Morris looked like he'd seen a ghost. Mr. Wallace sat with his head in his hands. Whether from shame or shock, Eleanor couldn't tell. In the student section, a girl in the 3rd row was frantically typing on her phone. She pulled up a search engine and entered a name. Then she gasped and showed her screen to the students around her. They looked, their eyes widening, and passed the phone to others. Within minutes, half the student section was searching the same thing on their own phones. The applause continued. Eleanor stood slowly from the piano bench. She'd forgotten what this felt like. This acknowledgement, this recognition, this moment of connection between performer and audience. She'd forgotten how it filled something inside her that had been empty for so long. She gave a small bow. Nothing dramatic, just a simple acknowledgement of their response. The applause grew even louder. People were whistling now, stomping their feet. It went on, minute after minute, until finally Mrs. Chen had to step onto the stage and gently guide Eleanor off so the show could continue. Eleanor tried to slip away immediately after leaving the stage. She headed for the backstage exit, the one that led to the back parking lot where her old car was waiting. She just wanted to leave, to go home, to process what had just happened in private. But people were already crowding around her. Teachers she'd worked with for 8 years suddenly wanted to talk to her. They grabbed her hands, told her how amazing she was, how they had no idea. Their faces showed shock, admiration, and something else. Guilt, maybe. Shame. Eleanor nodded politely at their compliments but kept moving toward the exit. Then Principal Morris appeared, blocking her path. His face had gone from pale to red, his usual confident expression replaced by something she'd never seen before. He looked shaken. "Eleanor," he said, his voice lacking its usual boom. "That was extraordinary. I had no idea you could play like that. Where did you learn?" "I've played for a long time," Eleanor said quietly. She tried to step around him, but he moved with her. "No, you don't understand," he said. "That wasn't just good. That was professional level. World class. I've attended concerts at Carnegie Hall. What you just did belongs in a concert hall, not a high school talent show." Other teachers had gathered around them now, forming a circle. Eleanor felt trapped. Her heart started racing again, but for different reasons than before. This was the attention she'd spent years avoiding. This was exactly what she didn't want. "Eleanor, please," Mrs. Chen said, stepping forward. Her eyes were still red from crying. "You have to tell us. Who are you, really?" Before Eleanor could answer, a student pushed through the crowd. It was the girl who'd been searching on her phone during the performance. She was holding her phone out, the screen showing a web page. "I know who she is," the girl said breathlessly. "Look." She turned the phone so everyone could see. On the screen was a Wikipedia page with a black and white photograph of a young woman sitting at a piano. The woman had dark hair and intense eyes and was dressed in an elegant concert gown. The caption read, "Eleanor Hayes, pianist." Mrs. Peterson leaned in to read the screen, then gasped. "Oh my God." Other phones came out immediately. Within seconds, a dozen people were searching, finding articles and videos and reviews. Principal Morris pulled out his own phone, his fingers shaking as he typed. His face went even paler as he read. "You performed with the New York Philharmonic," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "When you were 7 years old." The crowd pressed closer. Eleanor felt like the walls were closing in. She wanted to run, but her legs wouldn't move. "Carnegie Hall," Mrs. Peterson read from her phone. "Royal Albert Hall in London. Sydney Opera House. You've played in every major concert hall in the world." 3 albums, another teacher added. "All critically acclaimed." "Awards," someone else said. "International competitions. You were called a prodigy." The student who'd found the Wikipedia page was scrolling through it, her eyes wide. "It says you gave your first public performance when you were 4. You were touring internationally by age 10. You played with the Berlin Philharmonic when you were 16. Why are you working as a janitor?" Mr. Wallace asked. The mockery was completely gone from his voice. He just sounded confused and ashamed. Eleanor looked at all these faces staring at her. These people who'd ignored her, dismissed her, made jokes at her expense. They wanted answers. They wanted to understand. They wanted to know why someone who'd performed for presidents and royalty was now mopping their floors. "Please," she said quietly. "I need to go." "Eleanor, wait," Mrs. Chen said, reaching for her arm. "We owe you an apology. The way we treated you. If we'd known, you shouldn't have treated me that way regardless of who I was," Eleanor said. Her voice was still quiet, but there was steel in it now. "I didn't deserve your mockery when you thought I was nobody. And I don't need your admiration now that you know I was somebody." The crowd fell silent. Several teachers looked down at their feet. Mrs. Chen pulled her hand back, her face crumbling. Eleanor finally managed to push through the crowd and make it to the exit, but Principal Morris followed her out into the parking lot. "Eleanor, please," he called after her. "At least tell me why. Why did you stop performing?" "Why are you here?" Eleanor stopped walking. She stood there in the parking lot under the yellow glow of the streetlights, and for a long moment she didn't say anything. Then she turned to face him. 15 years ago, she said, her voice steady despite the tears forming in her eyes. "My husband and daughter were killed in a car accident. I was supposed to be with them, but I had a rehearsal. They were coming to pick me up when it happened." Principal Morris's face fell. "Eleanor, I'm so sorry." Music was everything to me," she continued. "It was my whole life. But it was tied to them, to my family. Every performance, every practice, every moment at the piano reminded me of what I'd lost. I couldn't do it anymore. I couldn't even hear music without breaking down. So I stopped. I packed everything away and I found the quietest, simplest life I could. I took a job where nobody knew me, where I could just exist without expectations or memories. But tonight you played," Principal Morris said softly. "Tonight I played," Eleanor agreed. She wiped at her eyes with the back of her hand. "I don't know why I said yes. I should have refused. I should have called in sick. But something made me do it. And when I started practicing again, when I put my hands on that piano for the first time in 15 years, it all came back. Not just the music, but the joy I used to feel. The part of me I thought died with them." She looked back at the school building. Through the windows, she could see people still gathered in the auditorium, phones out, talking animatedly. "Playing tonight didn't fix everything," she said. "I'm not suddenly healed. I'm not going to start performing again. But it reminded me that I'm still here, that the part of me that loved music is still alive, buried under all that grief, but still there." Principal Morris didn't say anything for a moment. Then he cleared his throat. Eleanor, I need to apologize. The way I've treated you for 8 years. I talked down to you. I acted like you were incapable. I never even tried to know you as a person. You weren't alone in that, Eleanor said. No, but I'm the principal. I set the tone. And I failed. He looked genuinely distressed. Is there anything I can do to make this right? Eleanor thought about it. Treat people with respect, she said finally. All people, not just the ones with impressive credentials. The janitor, the cafeteria worker, the security guard. They're all human beings with their own stories. You don't know what anyone is carrying. He nodded, looking properly chastened. You're absolutely right. I'll do better. Eleanor turned to leave again, but he spoke once more. Would you consider teaching? We have students who would benefit tremendously from your knowledge. Not many, but a few who are serious about music. I don't know, Eleanor said honestly. Maybe. I need to think about it. Over the following weeks, things changed at Westbrook High School. The video of Eleanor's performance had been posted online and had gone viral. Thousands of people watched the janitor who turned out to be a legendary pianist. News outlets picked up the story. A few journalists tried to track her down for interviews, but Eleanor refused them all. At school, the teachers treated her differently. They spoke to her with respect, looked her in the eye, asked about her day. Some apologized directly for their past behavior. Others just showed through their actions that they were trying to do better. Eleanor accepted both with quiet grace. The students were fascinated by her. They asked questions about her performing career, about the famous musicians she'd worked with, about what it was like to play in the world's greatest concert halls. Eleanor answered what she could, though talking about that part of her life was still difficult. But the biggest change was in Eleanor herself. One afternoon, about 3 weeks after the talent show, a shy freshman girl approached her in the hallway. The girl held a violin case and looked nervous. Mrs. Hayes, she said quietly, I heard that Principal Morris asked if you'd teach. I was wondering if you might consider it. I've been teaching myself piano from YouTube videos, but I'm not very good. I can't afford real lessons, but I love music more than anything. Eleanor looked at this girl, seeing something of herself at that age. The hunger to learn, the passion for music, the need for guidance. What's your name? Eleanor asked. Lily, the girl said. Okay, Lily. Meet me in the auditorium after school tomorrow. Bring whatever music you've been working on. Lily's face lit up. Really? You'll teach me? We'll see if you're willing to work hard enough, Eleanor said. But she was smiling. That next afternoon, Eleanor sat beside Lily at the piano, showing her proper finger placement, explaining the basics of reading music, correcting her posture. 2 other students showed up and asked if they could watch. Eleanor let them stay. By the end of the week, she had 5 students. She still worked as a janitor. She still lived in her small apartment. She still carried her grief like a weight she'd never fully put down. But something had shifted. She'd opened a door she thought was locked forever, and light was coming through. One evening, alone in the auditorium after her impromptu students had left, Eleanor sat at the piano. She played quietly just for herself. Not Rachmaninoff this time. Something simpler, something her daughter used to request, a lullaby. As she played, she realized she was crying, but they weren't only tears of sadness. There was something else mixed in. Gratitude, maybe, for having loved so deeply, for having had a family even if she'd lost them, for having this gift even if she'd hidden it for so long, for still being here, still breathing, still capable of creating beauty. The music filled the empty auditorium, and for the first time in 15 years, Eleanor didn't run from it. She let it surround her, hold her, remind her that being alive meant feeling everything. The joy and the pain, the loss and the hope. She was Eleanor Hayes. She'd been a child prodigy, an internationally acclaimed pianist, a wife, a mother. She'd been broken by grief. She'd hidden in plain sight. And now, finally, she was allowing herself to be seen again, not despite her pain, but alongside it.